Many asked for a part two to the conversation with Sean and Greg on Greg's book Street Smarts, so we are back. We pick up at the tail end of Sean and Greg's discussion on biblical slavery. Greg thinks he has the coup de grace on the issue. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. Welcome to Anja as my newest patron. Thank you, Anja.
What is your basis for objection given your atheism, given your materialistic view of reality?
Before we go on, it should be noted that not all atheists are materialists. Atheism neither requires nor entails a naturalistic worldview. Most atheists are materialists, but most Republicans are Christians, yet it would not be fair to say that therefore if a person is a Christian, that then they must be a Republican.
And of course, there is no basis of objection. What moral principle inherent to atheism disallows human slavery?
Why would a principle need to be inherent to atheism for an atheist to adhere to it? There is no principle inherent to Christianity that disallows human slavery. If there were, you would not be defending biblical slavery. If you, Greg, can hold to the view that slavery is immoral despite your Christian worldview not having an inherent principle to the contrary, why do you have a problem with atheists being able to do the same thing? The difference lies in your system not only failing to condemn an immoral practice, but your religion even condones it. Yet you find fault with the atheist condemning the practice because their morals come from within each as individuals and not from an inherent tenet of atheism. Why do you think you have the high ground because your religion gives you inherent moral tenets? Has your religion fared better with these supposedly superior moral tenets? Let's see. We have the Crusades, the Inquisition, religious wars, burning witches, and more recently, the sex scandals of priests in the Catholic Church and pastors in the Protestant ones, covering sexual abuse and child abuse within the ranks of their leaders. We have hate preachers calling for the deaths of targeted groups, and widespread calling for denial of medical care for the transgender community. How is this a moral high ground? You can shout foul all you want that these are poor examples of your faith or that these don't really follow the tenets of your faith but rather pervert it. Nevertheless, these are the leaders of your faith, and the acts, even if a violation of the tenets of your faith, they still continue to lead your faith with impunity. Having an inherent moral tenet against a particular immoral act doesn't seem to have any bearing on resultant behavior. In which case, I ask, of what value are your so-called inherent moral tenets? If the net result is that believers are no different from unbelievers, then what does it matter if my morals originate from a collection of my genetic instincts and my human experiences, or from a religion that tells me what I'm supposed to think is right or wrong? What I find is that the believer, just like the atheist, gets their morals from the same place, a collection of genetic instincts and human experiences. I say that because you just spent the last 10 minutes defending a position that goes against what your Bible endorses, that humans can be owned as property. If you really believe that your morals came from your Bible, then you should be able to simply say that God is fine with slavery, and therefore slavery is morally acceptable. But you don't. You can't, because you know this isn't acceptable. It isn't that your Bible tells you this, because owning a person isn't a violation of any inherent tenet of your worldview. That you find such a thing immoral comes from another source, most likely the same source as mine, the collection of your genes and human experiences. Since you, Greg, don't get your moral repugnance of this act from any tenet inherent to your worldview, why would you expect that of me?
The answer is there is none. because there is no moral principle inherent to atheism at all. There are no moral principles. Now, atheists can adopt principles if they want, and they do. So I'm not saying that all atheists are immoral.
Of course.
That's true, but I don't look to atheism to get my moral principles, just like I don't look to get clothes from the soup store.
Hello? Hey, what's up? I need your help. Can you come here? I can't. I'm buying clothes. All right, well, hurry up and come over here. I can't find them. What do you mean you can't find them? I can't find them. There's only soup. What do you mean there's only soup? It means there's only soup. Well, then get out of the soup aisle! All right, you don't have to shout at me! There's more soup! What do you mean there's more soup? There's just more soup! Go into the next aisle! There's still soup! Where are you right now? I'm at soup! What do you mean you're at soup? I mean I'm at soup! What store are you in? I'm at the soup store! Why are you buying clothes at the soup store?
What is the basis, morally speaking, from your worldview that allows you to raise this kind of criticism? Or, as I point out in the book, if somebody wants a question, where are you getting your moral standards that you're using to judge God by here in the Bible?
Why do I even need one? If we both agree that owning people is morally wrong, what difference does it make that I arrived at that conclusion from a different perspective than you did? The fact that we both arrived at the same conclusion should suffice that it's probably a good conclusion, regardless of how we got there.
And that's a question. So notice there's a little beat there, a silent moment. Yeah, they got to answer that.
I'll let Vice Rhino handle this one.
Tossing out the "where do you even get your morals from, though" question serves as nothing more than a thought-stopping technique designed to prevent you from reaching an inevitable conclusion that you don't like. So if that question is your default response anytime you see someone pointing out your God's moral failings, ask yourself why that is. Why is it that, rather than come to grips with the fact that the God described by the Bible has done things that are unambiguously immoral, you instead choose to deflect from that issue in an attempt to distract from the main topic of the conversation? Because, to me, it looks like that you're desperate to change topics. It's just not the gotcha question that some people seem to think it is.
I get my limits from a rational consideration of the consequences of my actions. That's how I determine what's moral. I get it from a foundation that says my actions have an effect on those people around me, and theirs have an effect on me. And that if we're going to live cooperatively and share space, we have to recognize that impact.
The conclusion is that slavery is immoral, and the Bible God condones such a practice, thus God is immoral, regardless of the path that you took to get to this conclusion. Could it be that you only ask this because you want to deflect from the question?
Well, believing in God is a science stopper. If you say God caused something, that prevents us from moving forward and finding a scientific explanation.
This one depends on the form of Christianity one ascribes to. Some of them are science deniers, like the young earth creationists, but not all of them. Some scientists are Christians, and their faith doesn't stop them from questioning how the world around them works.
What does that look like? What does scientific answer look like to you?
It means observing the natural world, the physical world, and explaining how things operate, rather than bringing in principles and things we can't see or touch or feel, hence something spiritual.
What if it turns out that the thing that caused what you see was not caused by a natural force?
If he believes that God holds the atoms together, but we discover that no, it's some other natural force, is that going to affect his religious beliefs? I doubt it. This kind of thing has happened. Galileo was considered a heretic for claiming that the earth revolved around the sun, but he was right. If Christianity is true, it should be able to stand up to scientific scrutiny. If we find proof positive that the universe originated by natural forces, this doesn't preclude you from still believing in your God. It might cast doubt on whether your God is a creator God or not, but it's always easy for the believer to look at a natural process and claim that God has a guiding hand in it. Since they claim God has a guiding hand in everything else, it's impossible to demonstrate that there's a difference between things God does and doesn't have a guiding hand in. That's an unfalsifiable claim.
Is that possible in your mind, Sean?
It's logically possible, but I don't see a shred of evidence that that's the case.
Okay, so you're using words in our conversation. What natural physical laws are causing your mouth to say the things that they're saying right now?
Well, they're coming from my body and through sound waves, and who I am is the cause of them. We could trace it back to my body.
There's the laws of motion, the natural way that muscles work, the way that brains work, the way language has developed over the centuries, and so on. I'm no expert in any of these areas, and thus I can't fully describe the processes.
Okay, so your body is just causing this according to naturalistic laws?
Sort of. It isn't any one law or group of laws, but my body is functioning the way bodies do in a natural world, or at least in our natural world. Could be different in a different world.
Yeah, I mean, there's no demon or angel behind the system
No,
here.
no,
We
I'm not
can
talking.
actually trace back.
I'm actually drawing a parallel here. I'm not appealing to God or demons, but I am making an appeal to you. Are you creating your words and using your mouth to say the words to me?
No. The words were created over a long period of time as language developed. If I was creating the words, you wouldn't be able to understand them, as there would be no common context that we both draw from for you to understand them. But we both live in the same culture and thus share a cultural understanding of the words I'm using. Words I didn't invent or create, but were taught to me so that I can communicate with others in my culture, like you.
Yeah, I am, but I'm just my body.
Rats. Sean blew that answer. He's looking at it that he is forming the words by saying them, which he is, but he missed that the question was, did he create the words? No, he didn't.
Well, if you're just your body and all this is a series of events that are taking place, if you're just your body, then how is it that you have any freedom to choose the questions in response to me right now?
Sorry, but that question made no sense. What does my ability to say what I have to say have to do with the makeup of my body? Without my body, I wouldn't be able to do that, as without my body, I would be dead. I wouldn't exist at all. But what goes on in my mind isn't tied to the fact that my body is the biggest part of me. I think we are back to looking for clothes in the soup store.
Why are you buying clothes at the soup store?
Well,
Because the natural things, dominoes falling, that's natural law. So you're saying natural law is causing all the things, just causing you to say all the things you're saying?
I mean, maybe we don't have freedom. Science has actually showed the way the world actually works. Hence, we want an explanation for the origin of the world that we know science can give us. We bring in all these other things that you're talking about here. We've moved beyond science. So it's possible that I have free will.
The conversation has completely changed. Sean brought up science, and Greg shifted to the topic of free will. Why? Is he trying to avoid the science question?
Well, if you don't, you just told me that science has shown. That means you've concluded that science has provided evidence that allows you to make this conclusion, the statements that science has shown, right? You concluded
Yes.
that. Okay,
Sure.
well, that confuses me because I thought what you just told me is that it is the forces of nature and science and natural law and everything that is causing your mouth to move the way it's moving. Okay, so how can you have confidence in drawing a conclusion about something when you are determined by natural law to say the things you're saying or to think the things you're thinking?
Because natural law is only one factor. What determines what a person does is partly the combination of the individual's experiences. If that were not so, all people would do the same thing in the same given circumstance. Since humans do not behave that way, we know that people do not act by natural law alone.
Well, that's where science comes in because there's peer review and claims can be tested against the empirical physical world
Sure. Okay,
and
maybe it
see
wasn't
if
clear.
they actually match up.
Sean's not wrong, but I don't think he answered the question that Greg asked.
Maybe I wasn't clear in my response then. What you're doing here, what you just described, is a cognitive process, okay, where you're seeing and assessing based on the evidence. But what you described to me a few moments ago about the nature of the process is not a seeing and describing of the evidence, but merely a deterministic response based on stimulus from the environment. If you are determined, okay, then whatever you believe about science is not a result of the evidence of science, it's a result of the determination that governs your beliefs. Do you see the point I'm making?
Yes, but those factors are not all naturalistic. Many of them are experimental. We have no way of separating the two as they work together. Is your worldview not also deterministic? If God is omniscient and timeless, as you claim, if your God knows how all of history will end, the book of Revelation is future history, then the world is predetermined. Every act of every person is known to God before he does it. He cannot choose to do anything not foreknown and preordained by God. Now, I realize that you would not say that it was predetermined, but how can it not be? If God knows you will do X, then you cannot choose to do Y instead. You might feel like doing X was your decision and choice, but since God already knew you would do it, and God can't be wrong, He's omniscient, then you could not choose otherwise. Now back this up to your conception. If God made you, from the moment He made you, He knew all that you would do in your lifetime, then the act of making you determined that you would do X. If God didn't want you to do X, He need only have made a different version of you that would not do X. Thus, you see, you already have a deterministic worldview, even if it doesn't feel like it to you.
I do. Okay, so let me jump in here. I feel like I
Okay.
could keep pushing back
Yeah.
on this and we could have this conversation for a while. Let's take a step back because you paused a couple times and thought I could go take this a few different directions.
Yeah.
And one, it seemed when I said God is a science stopper, it sounds like you were starting with the challenge of like trying to say, who am I? Is this just chemicals in motion?
That's right.
Thinking I might not just say, oh, I'm just a body and kind of bite the bullet on that one, which makes sense. And then you are going to make an analogy back towards if there's a self that can cause something that's not physical, could there be a God that causes something that's not physical?
I'm not sure there is a self that can cause something that is not physical.
That
That's
was the
exactly
first
right.
route you were taking. Is that correct?
That's correct. No, that's right. And I was trying to, and what this is demonstrates is these conversations can go in lots of different directions.
That's right.
They're not always really tidy, and you make decisions on the run or on the fly, so to speak, about how you want to prosecute the conversation with questions.
Greg is right. It's why using a script for such a conversation doesn't work. The person you talk to may not answer the way you expect.
Because there are so many different things that occurred to me in the things you said that I could pursue here. But that was my main logic. You said there's no evidence for these invisible entities that might be influencing things like God or whatever. We have science, blah, 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 to make the determinations for us. And my point was, well, you are an invisible entity that's making things happen.
Am I an invisible entity? That's a weird one. I know what he means. He means that the part of you that is really you is invisible. He would call this the soul or spirit. But does such a thing exist? I don't think so. Why not? Animals move, make sounds, and do most of what humans do. Yet Greg would say that an animal doesn't have a soul or spirit. If an animal can be a sentient being without an invisible soul that is at the core of who they are, then I can too.
You're making your mouth move. You're coming to conclusions based on evidence, none of which could happen in a meaningful way if you were determined, as you suggested you might be.
Then how do they happen in your deterministic worldview?
As I could have asked you, do you know how modern science started? And I go into quite a bit of detail on this in the book. Modern science started in the West, not in the East. It started in the West because there was a deep conviction that human beings were made by an intelligent creator to have capabilities of assessing their environment and making changes in their environment. They could discover truth because there was a God who made a world that made it possible for them to do that.
Now Greg is just projecting. Yes, humans discovered that we can observe and make discoveries about the world. But this isn't because humans thought they were made by God. It's in spite of that. Yes, early Western scientists were believers. They had to be. At least, they had to claim to be, as the state forced their religion on them. So pointing out that during the Enlightenment, when there were penalties, sometimes extreme penalties, for denying the state faith, all claim to hold to that same state faith. That isn't evidence that their faith led to the discoveries. Next, Many of these early scientists, though believers, were not Christian, they were Muslim. Is it just belief in a God that causes you to look at and want to discover more about the universe around you? Or is that just a human trait? Finally, science is not limited to the Western world. Not only were there Muslim scientists in the Near East, scientists from the Far East were in no way influenced by Christian concepts of God. I'll grant you that science was not pursued as much in the Far East as it was in the West, due primarily to philosophical differences. What's more mind-boggling is why a God that wants people to know about him left so much of the world in the dark about him until global navigation became a thing. Could God not have just given the secrets of sea navigation to Moses on Mount Sinai instead of a bunch of rules about how to treat your slaves?
They have accurate or reasonably accurate access to the world, and therefore they can discover things about the world that told them a little bit more about the one who made the world.
It's just your Western bias that makes you see it that way.
The driving force, the driving worldview that started the whole scientific project was a Judeo-Christian worldview. If they were in India and they believed that religiously that the world was an illusion, Maya, well, they wouldn't have any motivation to want to examine the illusion.
And again, because it was the state religion, it was forced on them. They didn't have a choice in the matter. They also all came from the upper class. Why? Because only the upper class could afford to be educated. Does that mean that being wealthy shapes whether one considers the questions of how the world works or not? No. It just means that those are the ones who had the means to explore such things. Further, your claims are just not true. Madhava of Sangamagrama was a 14th century mathematician and astronomer from India. He opened the Kerala School of Math and Astronomy. The development of a series of expansions for trigonomic functions, sine, cosine, and arctangent, was completed 2 centuries before the invention of calculus in Europe. The seamless celestial globe was invented in Kashmir by Ali Kashmiri in Lokwan. Hyder Ali, Prince of Mysore, developed war rockets with an important change: the use of metal cylinders to contain the combustion powder. At the battles of Serapatam in 1792 and 1799, these rockets were used with considerable effect against the British. I pulled these from a single Wikipedia page on the history of science in India, just from the section on the Enlightenment era, and yes, I verified that these were true from other sources. Showing Greg's problem is such a strong bias that he didn't even bother to do a simple Google search to find out if his claims are correct.
Because they were born in the West, most of them, the central figures of virtually every single discipline of science, they were almost every one of them a Bible-believing theist.
Right, because when Galileo discovered the solar system isn't geocentric, the church embraced that discovery, right? Or when Copernicus discovered that the Earth's rotation causes the appearance of the sun coming up, the church embraced that, right, and encouraged his work? Hell, to this day, many believers won't accept the work of Charles Darwin, Greg and Sean included. The Big Bang Theory was discovered by a Catholic priest, yet few believers endorse that. Greg does accept the Big Bang Theory. There are a lot of scientists in the Christian ranks, but time and again your church claims their discoveries clash with church doctrine and declare them to be heretical. And when they can no longer be denied by any rational means, the church is slowly dragged, kicking and screaming, into the modern age. Eventually, this will be the case with evolution. The Big Bang Theory, as well as some believers, including Greg, are now embracing it as a Christian discovery of how their Bible was right all along, reinterpreting their Bibles to a Big Bang model. The point is that science advances through the discoveries of brilliant people, some Christian, some not, and the church is anti-science, as it rejects many of these discoveries until it simply is no longer possible to do so. Greg holds that evolution and Christianity are in direct opposition to one another. Even you personally, Greg, do not embrace science, but rather attempt to deny science to hold to your beliefs. Your own stance proves the objection that Sean raised. The National Center for Science Education pointed out the illogic and inconsistency of Gregg's position. At the heart of Kokel's position are a couple of unfortunate assertions. One is that in the case of evolution, the methodological naturalism necessary to the function of science has become equivalent with philosophical naturalism. Because direct intervention by God contrary to natural law is not included with evolutionary processes, God either does not exist or is at best impotent. This principle is certainly not consistently applied to all scientific theories. There are many other scientific theories accepted by Kokel and other old Earth creationists, which do not refer to miracles in contravention to natural law. In those cases, God is considered to be the author of natural phenomena. Therefore, violation of natural law is not necessary to infer the hand of God. Evolution is merely an effort to describe life as an ongoing natural phenomena. Chance and purpose may be mutually exclusive in all instances, save one, the instance of God. If God exists and is the author of the universe, in God's case, chance and purpose are one and the same, by definition. For purposes of discussion, let us stipulate that it was that errant bolide that whacked the Yucatan some 60-something million years ago that put the period at the end of the dinosaurian sentence. This freed up all of the choice ecological niches for our mammalian ancestors, which in turn allowed for the development of us. From the point of view of a scientist, no laws of nature have been violated. As fortuitous as it turned out to be, it was just a natural phenomena. Impacts happen, but just perhaps God arranged the foundations of the universe for just the proper-sized asteroid to be dislodged from its comfortable orbit and be sent on a collision course with our destiny. This is not something that can be explored empirically. Science is in no position to include nor exclude divine motivations behind natural events. Our role is only to describe the natural events themselves. Gregg, if you are able to embrace that a meteor killed the dinosaurs 60 million years ago, and that we see starlight that travels millions of light years to get to us, how is it that you cannot accept that a God could guide the process by which humans evolved from other animals? I know the answer to that question, because it destroys the theology that there was no sin until the fall of Adam and Eve, the first humans. And the fall is central to Christian doctrine, as without it, there is no sin for Jesus to die for. If Adam and Eve were the first humans to sin, and those before them were sinless, then the Bible is wrong about all humans being sinners. And of course, the Bible can't be wrong about anything. Eventually, denial of evolution will die. Like heliocentrism, believers will discover that they can worship their God just the same, whether they accept evolution or not. In one sense, Gregg is right. Christianity need not be a science stopper. There are plenty of people who embrace both. Unfortunately, Gregg is not one of them, despite his claims. Until he can accept that human evolution in no way precludes the possibility of a God guiding the process, and that humans are capable of finding purpose and moral values apart from being a special creation, that will never happen. We must find a way to convince Gregg to accept that his God is perfectly capable of giving morals and purpose to humans that evolve as easily as to humans that are specially created. This is ironic. That in order for Gregg to embrace science, we have to argue to him that his God is really God and he's able to do this. Somehow, Gregg's form of God doesn't seem omnipotent, does it?
The conviction that God was there and that he made a world a certain way, that was the science starter. It wasn't the science stopper, okay? But I do have another question about this. I think you're right. Now I'm going back a little bit into a role play. I think science is great to be able to describe the way things happen in a natural realm. The problem is some things that can't be explained, even in principle, by the kinds of ways science explains the world. Event causing event according to natural law, okay? Like dominoes falling. So, for example, you know probably a little bit about DNA, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, evolution, DNA, mutations and all that. When you have a mutation of DNA, you have a change of the code, it produces a different kind of physical feature, right? And maybe that's adapted better to survive.
Greg seems to understand the process. So where does he go wrong?
So there's a whole code, right? Here's the question. Who wrote the code?
Let's let Greg have God did it. Not that I believe that, but suppose we give you that, Greg. Can you now embrace evolution if we give you that God wrote the code and guided the process? If you are willing to come this far, I'd be happy to leave you in that stance. Getting you out of the way of allowing believers to embrace evolution would be worth the trade-off.
I mean, we know where code comes from because we live in a digital age. Bill Gates reminds us, looking at DNA, that's code. And code comes from coders.
I know he's making the error of thinking the DNA code is like computer code. It isn't. It's just the way nucleotides bond with one another. But again, if we give him that God gave the code, then can he embrace evolution?
My challenge at this point is to help people see that even though science, in most cases, is perfectly adequate to explain the events that we see happening in the world, there are some circumstances that a naturalistic process simply cannot account for.
Cannot or hasn't yet. But again, Greg, can we meet you halfway? If we grant you a God guiding the process, a God writing the code for DNA, then can you accept that evolution is real?
And when we look more closely at those processes, like the DNA code, it bears all of the earmarks of intelligence.
Endogenous retroviruses, Greg. Why would a God put endogenous retroviruses into the code that he specially created for humans? That makes no sense. For anyone who might not know, endogenous retroviruses are a family of viruses that are passed down in the genome. It's easy for geneticists to trace lineage with them as they appear in all lines from an animal that has that virus in that exact location. They comprise 5 to 8% of the human genome. Any virus inserted into the chimp genome before the chimp-human split would show up in both chimps and humans in the exact same location. Any virus inserted into either the chimp or human genome after the split would appear only in the species incurring the virus. If evolution is true, scientists would expect to find a high degree of similarity in retroviruses in chimps and humans if they have a common ancestor. So what did they find? They found 211 insertions in the human DNA and 208 in the chimp DNA. 3 insertions were unique to the chimpanzee. So there were 214 total insertions. 205 of the 214 were identical for humans and chimpanzees. That humans would have the same code for the same viruses that became fixated in chimp DNA in the exact same location precludes any possibility of humans being a special creation of God, with one exception. If God intentionally created the DNA code to include the endogenous retroviruses to fool human scientists into thinking that evolution is a natural process, which leaves you with 3 options. Either 1, God wrote this code but is lying to us by including intentionally deceptive markers to hide his existence, in which case your God doesn't want us to believe in him. He wants us to believe evolution is real, even though it isn't. And who are you, Greg, to stand in God's way if God wants us to believe in evolution as a mysterious and incomprehensible plan? 2, evolution is a God-guided process that resulted in endogenous retroviruses naturally occurring, and God just saw no reason to fix these. 3, there is no God, and human evolution is a wholly natural process. I gave you an out, Greg. Choose option 2, and you can hold to both your faith and evolution, as so many believers do. If you want more information on endogenous retroviruses, click on the link in the description in the sources to Stated Clearly's video on endogenous retroviruses. To deny evolution is to deny the reality of the human genome's similarity to the chimp genome, especially when it comes to endogenous retroviruses.
We don't have to show that there's no examples of belief in God stopping science. There probably are some examples, and we're happy to concede those.
It would be pretty hard not to with people like Ken Ham and Kent and Eric Hovind out there. Greg would agree that young earthers are science deniers, but as you saw, Greg is also a science denier, as he's unable to embrace evolution, and Sean as well. I really would like to see either of these two confronted with the question of endogenous retroviruses and ask, is it not possible that God guided an evolutionary process? I could find no source where either of these addressed this issue.
But is it by its nature a science stopper?
Right.
That's the heart of the claim.
And as you see from my granting you the possibility of a God-guided evolution, I do not think Christianity is by its nature a science stopper. The fact that many can and do embrace both shows that it is not. Unless you go to the Ken Ham route that anyone who doesn't believe young Earth is a heretic. Ham's form of Christianity, by its nature, is a science stopper. So now we arrive at another question. What is Christianity? You know, maybe I should make a documentary about this and ask a bunch of believers, what is a Christian? And show that they can't agree on what the definition of a Christian is. And maybe there's a problem with the Christian ideology. Or maybe we should just accept that a Christian is anyone who identifies as a Christian.
So I want to know what they're thinking. And then we could go the kind of philosophical route that you went, or the fact-based route, which says, wait a minute, just look historically speaking. Has belief in God stopped science, or has it developed it?
Has the church embraced these scientists, or has it been dragged kicking and screaming to accept reality? Come on, Sean. Surely you can see that the greatest scientific advancements were never embraced by the church until it became impossible for them to deny them. This is not developing science. Science had developed in spite of, not because of the church.
What we can do is have a conversation that draws another person out in a friendly fashion and see what happens. And if nothing else happens but that we let them talk about their view and flesh out their objections a little bit more thoroughly, then what we've done is we've gotten an education on their objection. And on our own, we can then find out more information.
He's right here. This is what I try to do on my streams when I have a theist on.
So make a distinction for me, Greg. How much are the questions just to understand and learn versus to advance a particular idea? And maybe this is a difference between Columbo question 1 and question 3 that you're talking about. So for example,
Yes.
your question to me a minute ago when we were role-playing was something to the effect of seeing information and the genetic code. You know, how does this get there without a mind? Something to that effect.
Sure.
And I was going to respond and say, wait a minute, this is begging the question. You are loading the question by assuming that things like this need a mind. Now, that would have been maybe how I pushed back. So are you asking questions because you know you have certain conviction, you have certain beliefs about the Bible, and these questions are to advance to the point that you are trying to make? Or are these just questions to understand?
An excellent question. I realize that the Christian doctrine teaches that one should try to advance one's faith by teaching it to others. I would hope that there would be no deception in the conversation. I mean, if you tell someone that you want to learn more about what they think, then you shouldn't approach the conversation with a proselytizing agenda. If you have mixed reasons for the conversation, that's fine, but don't claim to have one purpose when you really have another.
I think there's more going on than those two things. They are questions to understand, okay? But in my understanding, when I get a clear picture of what the person is doing or what they believe, okay, now I'm in a position to ask myself, okay, do I have an avenue here, based on what I know, to use more questions to show a weakness or a flaw?
Note how Greg is so sure of his position that he cannot have an honest conversation. If his point is to find a weakness or a flaw with his interlocutor, he is starting with the assumption that such a flaw exists. I'm not saying that atheists have no weaknesses or flaws. We do. But if you begin with the mindset that you're going to show me my weaknesses and flaws, you are assuming that you have the superior position. You have begun with the assumption that you are right and I am wrong, and you just need to show me where I am wrong. This is not the ingredients for a good conversation. This has all the earmarks of a smug, arrogant know-it-all that thinks his way of thinking is the only way of thinking. And that is something inherent to your religious beliefs. As your religion claims, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me.
And if somebody would have brought up that point that you just offered, for example, that, well, you're just loading it with your question, who wrote the book? And that's circular reasoning. I'm going to say, well, wait a minute. Are you saying, Sean, that it's not appropriate for me to ask who wrote this book?
Greg is referring to a point I skipped over where he said that books have authors and books don't appear without someone writing them. But this question then makes the entire Bible fair game. If the Bible exists, and it does, who wrote it? God sure didn't, so who did, and why? There are lots of authors, many unknown, and we don't know their motivations for writing the book. So, if it's appropriate for you to ask who wrote your book, is it not all the more appropriate for me to question who wrote the book that you claim is absolute truth?
This is a book, right? Isn't that an appropriate question for this kind of information? This is the kind of information in the DNA double helix. Why isn't that an appropriate question of the DNA double helix? Okay.
It is an appropriate question, and if you want to say God wrote the code of DNA, I'm willing to give you that belief, if you are willing to address the question of why the DNA contains endogenous retroviruses that point to evolution. Is your God being deceptive? Is this a God-guided natural process, or is this a purely natural process, no God needed? I'm giving you an out, Greg. You can have your faith and reality too.
People are not as scary as they thought. Okay. Sometimes the objector is like giants in our own eyes. We're grasshoppers, they're giants, kind of thing, like the spies there in the book of Numbers. And we're also going to find out that they're not as smart as we thought. Now, I'm not saying they're dumb, but it's very easy for us to think they must have much better reasons than they actually do have. And when we start talking to them, we realize, that's it? That's what you got?
That is exactly how I felt as I began this YouTube channel. I thought, who am I to question these big apologists who have been studying this their whole lives? But when I started dissecting their arguments, this is exactly where I came to. That's it? That's all you got? Because they keep bringing up the same old tired arguments that never work. They have the kalam that doesn't even get them to a god, let alone their god. Intelligent design, which is refuted by the lack of any intelligence behind some natural anatomy, as well as the endogenous retroviruses that we discussed. They have the moral argument, which merely assumes God and denies that morals can come from anywhere else, with no support for that claim. That consciousness exists, and that they see no way that consciousness can exist apart from a God making it. And that's about it. These are the things that we hear over and over. Some people are better at making the arguments than others, but they all boil down to these few. That's it. That's all they got. Live your life.